activist in exile, Canada does a good job of supporting people. But once you are here, you are by yourself and you come with your expertise. You don't leave your expertise behind. When you come, you bring it, but your expertise is underutilized. So I just wanted to say that the people that come, because I've done that, sometimes you try to work elsewhere and it's like, the Canadian experience is not there. But at the end of the day, you are coming with experience. And I think I come with a lot of wealth of experience. And there are so many women like me who actually have good experiences that can effectively contribute to the activist realities in Canada and beyond. So I think we should be able to tap on their expertise and support. That's really important. Support activists in exile, like help amplify their voices, create opportunities. Opportunities are very limited for activists in exile, and I think we have to start having conversations around that. Your work don't stop because you are exiled. You might need time to relax, re-energize, reset, whatever that looks like. But your work don't necessarily stop. My work never stops because I left the Gambia. My work, if anything, is more important to me today than it has ever been. I am Matida Daffeh. I'm from the Gambia, West Africa. My work, I consider myself a women's human rights defender, or at least part of that group. Or sometimes I'll just literally say I'm a feminist activist who strongly believe in social justice. And my work specifically is focused on women's sexual and reproductive health rights, but also on the political representation of women in the Gambia. These are things that are very much dear to my heart. So my activism, like most activists, is both personal and political. I am so much into female genital mutilation because not only am I from a practicing community, but I went through the practice myself at a very young age. It literally just kind of hit me when my young niece almost lost her life. That kind of hit me that this is happening, and she is not the only person, or I am not the only person. According to the UNICEF 2021 report, 46% of women 14 below experience female genital mutilation, and 76% of women and girls 15 and above all went through female genital mutilation. So that is a high number of women, exposed to that. And like globally, United Nations is saying almost 230 million women and girls were exposed to female genital mutilation. So looking at that, like it is a big thing. It is something that hugely impact women, not just Gambian women, but women globally, right? So that is something that has to change. Unfortunately, progress is very slow. Like the fact that like global efforts are like working towards eliminating the practice, it still exists, it's still a reality. There are so many girls that continue to be exposed even in the so-called countries where laws exist. So yeah, this is just something that is so much close to my heart, and I've done a lot and I continue to do my contribution to ensure that it is eliminated entirely. Firstly, like my work back home in the Gambia is geared towards women's sexual and reproductive health rights. And also, like the political representation of women in the Gambia is super low. You have women representing barely 8% in the parliament. And this is the parliament where things matters that affect women's rights, women's sexual and reproductive health rights are discussed. So just kind of like connecting to my work on sexual and reproductive health rights, I fight against female genital mutilation, not just in the Gambia, but also within the sub-region. According to the UNICEF 2021 report, in fact, a lot of women, like it states that 76% of women and girls have been exposed to female genital mutilation, 76% of the Gambian population. And 46% of girls ages 14 and below have been exposed to female genital mutilation. That is huge. It's not just a Gambian problem. It's not just an African problem. Globally, the United Nations estimate about 230 million women and girls who have been exposed to female genital mutilation. So that shows that this is not just a Gambian, just an African, just like a problem of a particular people. It is a global problem and affects lots of women. This is very dear to my heart, and it is something that I have done a lot to fight. Not because I am from a practicing community. Like I said, my work is both political but also very personal. I went through female genital mutilation at a very young age of my life, at about 5, 6 years of my life. Although I was a baby, a little child, I barely can recall a lot of things, but I know the pain. I still remember the pain. I still remember a whole, bunch of like things that I experienced. However, my conviction that this has to end was not even like my own childhood experience, but it's coupled with like other realities. For instance, my niece, when I was about 11, my niece almost lose her life. And I remember I was there, a child myself, and I thought she was going to die. And this was someone that was really close to my heart. She was really loved. And then it occurred to me that something has to be done. I don't know how. Like, I don't know when. I just don't, I could not figure out how it will. But I knew something has to change. I knew it wasn't right. I knew if we continue doing it, a lot of girls would risk their lives. Thinking about the practice, I started my activism in my late teens, like working with groups, kind of like getting more knowledge about female genital mutilation. And this is difficult because coming from a culture where it is practiced and living and even working within this community was very risky, very sensitive. But we had to take the risk because it is worth it, right? It is something that it was at the time barely discussed. We had, I think, just one organization in the Gambia at the time. It was the only organization doing the fight, but even with them, it was so hard that they barely had resources to do this fight. So here and there, when they had the opportunity, they would gather young people, gather organizations and talk about it. It was very tough. So I thought I could also add my voice. I joined like-minded organizations at some point in my life and co-founded a grassroots organization called the Girls Agenda to share our stories, to, talk about the practice, especially targeting young women and boys, because we feel that if we have to change, sometimes yes, we kind of engage elderly people and all that, but it was really hard. And although I was already in the work prior to the organization that I co-founded, I've served as a national trainer in the Gambia to kind of like talk to midwives, to talk to healthcare professionals, to talk to community. So I've done that. I've done a research, participated actively in research, but there was still something missing in my head. And that is targeting the young people, letting them know. Imagine you were caught as a baby and things around sex and sexuality are barely discussed in a culture where silence, like, taboos around sexuality, taboos around women's, reproductive sex, the genitalia is barely discussed. Women don't get to know a part of them that was even chopped. That was really hard. And I live this myself. I've talked to women about these things. And we thought we could actually do something. We could engage the young girls, talk to them about these things, about female genital mutilation, the implications, but also discussing, making it normal to talk about the female body, the genitalia, the clitoris. I talk about these things because we barely do. And these are things that have critical function, in women's reproductive health. Normalizing these conversations, sharing our stories, making it known that it's okay. Like, we got to know ourselves. We need to know a part or the parts that is like caught, why they shouldn't be caught, the importance they have on the female body, and all that not. So kind of like doing that work was really central. And not just in the Gambia, I also worked in other parts of the Senegambian region. I've worked in parts of southern Senegal, a conflict zone, and I've also worked in other parts of the south. So my work, not with the Girls Agenda, actually, with the organization that I co-founded, but with non-governmental organizations where I serve as gender specialist. So working with women, although in other areas of, like, let's say, livelihoods, I try to integrate my politics into my work, which is amplifying women's voices to understand the implications of sexual and reproductive health matters, problems of gender-based violence and implications on their lives and their communities. This is the work that I have done for over 15 years prior to coming to Canada. And eventually I come to Canada through Women's Human Rights Institute with beautiful Angela and Valda Facio. So I've done a lot of work. However, My work got me in trouble in the Gambia. We had a dictator for over 22 years in the Gambia. And talking about some of these things, I remember like literally for female genital mutilation, it was open. The president made it blatantly clear that whatever these people are doing in their communities, these people meaning women's human rights defenders, especially activism around female genital mutilation, it's like whatever you can do to them, do to them. So they were not protected in any way. That was a very difficult thing, right? It's like you are doing the work, but you are not protected. So if you go to the communities, a community who strongly or which strongly believe in these practices, you can imagine not just the verbal abuse that the human rights defenders or anti-FGMC supporters endure, but also harassment. I've not experienced this myself, but some people could be exposed to physical abuse. So it was a very difficult moment for a lot of human rights defenders. But we believe in the cause. We believe in what we are doing. We believe in the protection of the girl child. We believe in the protection of women. So we took the risk to continue doing the work. You cannot even have access to the national television to talk about these things, but yet it never stopped us. For instance, I remember when I had my trainings and my directors would tell me, you cannot talk about this. The radio talk show, for instance, or a training, a conversation with women's leaders and sometimes traditional leaders. And what I would do is, yeah, I know openly I cannot talk about this. So the way I would do it is I ask the women, what are some of the things that you endure, that you know that is not right, that you know that affect you? And then they will give me a list. So I'll just pick up the things that I think are really important and talk about that. Then I would say, these don't necessarily come from my mouth. So we have to strategize, be very wise in our advocacy. It was of high risk. We were risking our lives. Eventually, we had a training, and I remember an online news group published that I was a politician, a presidential candidate. And just like that, I got summoned to the National Intelligence Unit. But it was not based on that necessarily, because we all knew we just had a training on female genital mutilation. We were training the religious leaders and all that. The political situation in the Gambia was really crazy. So I guess there was fear, fear of the power of a young woman who was fearless in her activism, right? Who would push things that traditionally we would be like, no, these are no-go areas. So I think that fear of my work, my activism, but also my potential political engagement triggered the dictator at the time to send his machinery to me. I had to go and answer to the National Intelligence Agency. I had to do a series of interviews with them. But luckily, I am here. When I came, I was like, yeah, at least I need to be safe. I need to do this work. It's really important. But also, at the time, I had a 3-year-old. My son just turned 3. So that was really scary. These are the same people that would kill, rape, do whatever, disappear people literally. So I lived that fear for some time. And eventually, I was just scared, fearful of my life. So I think I renewed it because when I came again, I was very traumatic. It was really hard. Like, just come in, living. I left my son, I left my work. That was my wall. I left my people. In a very big family, being alone in this big country was really overwhelming. And of course, like, just settling in a new country. But to some point, I also thought leaving your country does not necessarily translate to like ending what you believe in, just kind of like closing a chapter. It's like, oh yeah, I'm not there and that's it. No, this is very personal to me. I still believe in like, pushing, just continue that advocacy work, albeit, in limited ways. Eventually, I realized that in my community, it was still barely discussed, even though we are in this part of the world. And that was where it first started. I just kind of like had a conversation, like just initiated a conversation, invited people and say, let's have a conversation. It was the first conversation on female genital mutilation within my community. And it was interesting to see that the thoughts that were coming, the beliefs that we have. So you understand that this is still something that, regardless of how far people are from their community, these are things that we still hold tight, right? It's like the belief that this is an integral part of our culture and it must be preserved. So that's where it started for me. And then eventually I started kind of like sharing with like-minded organizations, like partnering, networking, and kind of like starting conversations around it. I realized that female genital mutilation is barely discussed in Canada. There's still this ordering, like it is not a Canadian thing. We have other issues, but this is not a Canadian thing. And like in my head, if Canada is this big, welcoming country where you have people from all over the world, then female genital mutilation should be seen as a Canadian issue too. There must be investments, but Canada barely. And these are things that I think kind of like, I don't know. I feel hot, honestly. On the one hand, on the other, I also thought like there is a potential. There is a potential of like kind of like amplifying, and there are lots of survivors in this. I think FGMC Canada estimates about 100,000 Canadian, like people in Canada like having undergone female genital mutilation. That's still a lot, right? And probably there is much more. So I kind of started working on that. I've done presentations for different organizations, including the Women's Human Rights Institute. I've had conversations during their conferences, but also partnering with other organizations working in this domain. I continue to work on that because the work is important. I still do work back home and I'll continue doing that. I'll continue to support because the conversation on female genital mutilation is still very new. Just last year in 2024 March, there was a bill introduced to repeal the Women's Act, which only came into effect in 2015. So you can imagine Gambia only banned female genital mutilation just recently in 2015. And then 2024, there was a conversation to repeal a bill introduced to repeal the act. It happened just a few months ago, we would say, barely a year. That is to say that there is a lot that needs to be done when it comes to female genital mutilation. We all know laws are not an end. Even though we have the law, we have to continue this conversation because it is clear that although we are not doing the practice in big festivities like we used to, people are still mutilating their daughters. We have to continue engaging communities. We have to continue the education albeit the law. Law made it possible for activists to go into the communities knowing that now we are protected because this is against the Gambian law. But having National Assembly dominated by men talking about the genitalia of women, it hurts. That is not right. That is an oppression. It kind of renewed the spirit of activism, the spirit of advocacy around female genital mutilation, but also tying it to female representation in the parliament. Because imagine if we have enough women in the parliament, enough elected women in the parliament, the conversation might have been different. I mean, not just women who deeply understand the implications, who are so much involved in activism, who know that women should be protected, girls should be protected. I think these two are very much linked. A lot of people know that female genital mutilation is not a thing of the past. We have to continue. This is what I do. I do it here in Canada, but I also continue my work back home. In Canada, as much as I want it discussed, I also want it done in a decolonial manner. That is really important. When we talk about female genital mutilation, the voices of the survivors, the victims, whatever they're identifying themselves, must be amplified, but they must also be centered. You have lots of survivors here who need healthcare support, who need counseling, who need a whole lot of things, right? But this is why intersectionality matters, because when you talk about female genital mutilation in this part of the world, you have to look at it from an intersectional lens, right? If I go to my social worker or if I go to the clinic for support and I am going with this very thick accent, most people don't even know about it. Some people know, but in fragments here and there. So at the end of the day, you will have to educate them or advocate for yourself strongly. And this is what we think we have to work on, right? We have to encourage service providers to get to understand female genital mutilation, work with survivors, work with the practicing communities to support them, give them the right support that they require. That is really one thing. But also, like you said, the colonial mindset that save these people. There are so many nuances, right? So I think for me, this is where I stand. It's like I want this eliminated. I've invested my entire life in it, and I'll continue doing it because it is something that shouldn't have happened in the first place. But you know what I also tell people, patriarchy manifests in different ways. And maybe one way that it manifests in my community is through female genital mutilation because it is nothing but control. Of course, there are other people will tell you other things like, marriageability. People will tell you other things. It's a rite of passage. And as much as other things are important, the critical thing here for me is that we don't have to tamper with a woman's body, with a baby's body, because we want them to be clean. We don't have to tamper with a girl's body because we want her to be clean. And I am a Muslim too, right? So people use this wrongful Islamic interpretation. The conversations that we had in the Gambia, the problem was like people are kind of leaning towards Islam. But if you go through deeply and understand, you realize that it is nowhere in the Quran. It is not. Right, and the sunnahs that they are, that is like the book of the prophet, that they are kind of like, oh, how do I say, yeah, it's the book of the prophet that they use. The books they are using, I would consider them not authentic enough. That's how I would consider them. So fighting that is a reality. First, we have to decolonize the FGMC spaces in Canada. That is really important. But we have to have the conversation, the hard conversation of female genital mutilation being a human rights issue. It shouldn't have happened. Girls should not be exposed to it. I think these are the main challenges, and also the fact that sometimes it is hard based on these intersectional realities. Survivors here in Canada are even afraid to seek support. Making service providers understand, educating them on female genital mutilation, or encouraging them to educate themselves is essential. It is crucial because we will have survivors. Even if FGMC is entirely eliminated, you will still have people living with lifelong consequences. They would continue to need counseling. They would continue to need other support. They would continue to need guidance. And unfortunately, that is so much weak in Canada. So this is not individual. I'm not going to take individual ownership. I don't like that because I think like activism is a collective thing. You do things collectively, you achieve things together. With the elimination of female genital mutilation, for instance, the coming of the law in the Gambia, I think I contributed my part to it because I've been doing the fight prior before the law came into effect. So just seeing the law come into place, I was like, yeah, I did my part. When you go to communities in the country, you say my name. Hopefully, people still remember me. You talk about female genital mutilation, women's rights, gender based violence. One or two people will tell you, yeah, Matida was in this community. Girls will tell you, yes, we had sessions with Matida. And I was not just going and coming, I lived in the communities that I work. I lived and worked with the people. So that to me is an achievement to be able to raise consciousness, living with the people, working with them, getting, to do their daily activities with them, going back and forth, doing things. It was risky, but it was a beautiful experience and a huge achievement. I am really proud of the establishment of rather the girls' agenda. Again, I co-founded with so many like few other like-minded women. Today, I am not actively involved. I was the national coordinator from 2016, rather 2011, from its inception to 2016. But today, if I look at this organization, I went there in 2022, and looking at what the girls are doing, I'm proud of this organization. I'm proud of the journey, how it started, and now the impact that it is creating in the communities, the level of commitment of the girls who are now running this. Most of us who co-founded already left the country and they are still doing amazing work. When I look at that, I'm like, wow, this is something that I am hugely proud of. Their consciousness, and they continue to do this work. It is one huge achievement that I think not just me, a collective effort. We come together, we believed in the cause, we believed in ourselves because when we were starting, we had nothing. So it was us bringing our resources together, fundraising, sometimes even within our families. From the people that we know, we would take part of our salaries and say, we are investing this on the organization. And today, seeing them like work on like projects, I am beyond proud, honestly, of not just like the co-founders of us, but also for the amazing work that the young women on the ground are doing. First, I will talk to the activist. I'll tell the activists, I am proud of you, especially activists in exile here. You people are incredible. You've done incredible job and you continue to still do this work. You matter. Your voices matter. But I would also say take care of yourselves. Your mental health matters. Sometimes we don't think about these things, but it's really important that we kind of reflect. I'll say this because when I was exhausted. I was really exhausted, and I realized that I've taken so many things for granted. I barely had time for myself, like back home. I was constantly on the move, just walking. So it's intense, right? Emotionally, physically, mentally, in all aspects, it's really intense. So take care of yourselves. I think that is really important. What I will also say is activism is very transformational, and I think we should not argue about this. Social justice work is important, and we should all be invested. We should all be invested individually, collectively. We should all be invested in social justice work, whatever that looks like for us. For me, that has to do with the sexual and reproductive health rights of women, specifically female genital mutilation, because that is something that I experience and something that I see women and girls continue to be exposed to. So I would definitely say, activism pays off. It can make transformational changes in the lives and livelihoods of people.